I need to tell you about one of history's greatest ironies. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, controlling more territory than Rome ever dreamed of, collapsed not because of some great military defeat, not because they were conquered by a superior force, but because of a secret so devastating, so fundamentally destructive, that it tore apart the very fabric of what made them unstoppable. And here's the twist that'll blow your mind. This secret was built into their system from the very beginning, planted like a time bomb by Genghis Khan himself, the very man who created their greatest strength. Picture this. It's the year 1227. Genghis Khan, the man who united the fractious Mongol tribes, who turned nomadic herders into the most feared military machine in human history, who conquered everything from China to Persia, lies dying in his military camp. Around him gather his sons and his most trusted generals. The empire he built spans millions of square miles. His armies have never lost a major campaign. The Mongols are absolutely unstoppable. They've perfected warfare to an art form. Their composite bows can pierce armor at 300 yards. Their cavalry can cover 100 miles in a single day. Their intelligence networks know the weaknesses of every kingdom they target before a single arrow is fired. But in that tent, as the great Khan takes his final breaths, he makes decisions about succession that will ultimately doom everything he built. And the crazy thing is, he knew it. He absolutely knew it. He understood that the very system he was creating, the very principles he was establishing for how the empire would be ruled after his death, contained the seeds of its own destruction. But he did it anyway, because the alternative was even worse. Now, before we dive into what that secret was, we need to understand just how incredible the Mongol Empire actually was at its peak. We're talking about an empire that at its height controlled over 24 million square kilometers. That's roughly the size of Africa, the entire continent of Africa. The Mongols ruled over approximately 100 million people, which was something like a quarter of the entire world's population at the time. Think about that for a second. 1 in every 4 human beings alive answered to Mongol authority. And they didn't just conquer territory, they revolutionized it. The Mongols established what historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, which was essentially the medieval version of globalization. They created the largest free trade zone in history up to that point. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection like never before. Merchants could travel from Venice to Beijing with Mongol passports, knowing they'd be safe the entire journey. The Mongols guaranteed trade routes, standardized weights and measures across their empire, and established a postal system so efficient that Marco Polo claimed a message could travel from one end of the empire to the other faster than anywhere else in the world. They were also surprisingly progressive for their time. The Mongols practiced religious tolerance when the rest of the world was burning heretics. They promoted based on merit rather than birth, which was revolutionary. A common soldier could rise to general if he proved himself capable. They elevated women to positions of power that would have been unthinkable in medieval Europe or China. And they were absolutely obsessed with learning and knowledge. Whenever they conquered a city, they would spare the lives of scholars, engineers, and craftsmen, relocating them to other parts of the empire to spread their knowledge. But here's where it gets interesting. All of this, every single bit of the Mongol success, rested on one fundamental principle that Genghis Khan established: unity, absolute unity. The Mongols succeeded because they moved as one, they thought as one, they fought as one. Genghis Khan had taken dozens of squabbling tribes, each with their own leaders, their own traditions, their own feuds going back generations, and he forged them into a single people with a single purpose. That was his genius. That was his gift to his people. And that's exactly what made the empire so fragile. See, Genghis Khan understood something that most conquerors don't. He understood that an empire built on the personality of one man dies with that man. Alexander the Great's empire fractured immediately after his death. Charlemagne's empire lasted barely a generation after he was gone. Caesar's Rome descended into civil war. History is littered with empires that collapsed the moment their founder died because there was no clear system for succession, no legitimate way to transfer power. So Genghis Khan tried to solve this problem, and the solution he came up with was actually brilliant in theory. He decided that the empire would belong not to one man, but to the entire family, the Golden family, the Borjigin clan. Every descendant of Genghis Khan would have a claim to a share of the empire. The empire would be divided among his sons, and they would rule as a confederation, with the Great Khan, the supreme ruler, chosen by a Kurultai, a gathering of Mongol nobles and princes. On paper this sounds great, right? It's democratic-ish. It prevents any one branch of the family from monopolizing power. It ensures that multiple capable leaders can rule different regions while maintaining overall unity. It's actually a pretty sophisticated system for the 13th century. But here's the problem. Here's the secret that destroyed everything. The moment you divide an empire among multiple heirs, you create competition, you create jealousy, you create separate power bases with separate armies, separate treasuries, separate interests, and eventually, inevitably, those interests diverge. Genghis Khan divided his empire among his 4 sons from his principal wife Borte. The eldest, Jochi, got the western steppes, the territory that would become the Golden Horde. The second son, Chagatai, received Central Asia, the lands that would become the Chagatai Khanate. The third son, Ogedei, was designated as the Great Khan, the supreme ruler, and got Mongolia and northern China. The youngest, Tolui, got the traditional Mongol homeland and the bulk of the army. Now, Genghis Khan tried to make this work. He commanded his sons to respect the authority of Ogedei as Great Khan. He established rules for how disputes would be settled. He made them swear oaths. But he was asking the impossible. He was asking powerful men with armies at their command to permanently accept a subordinate position to their brother. He was asking human nature to be something other than what it is. And the cracks appeared immediately. Jochi and Chagatai hated each other. There were rumors that Jochi wasn't even Genghis Khan's biological son, that he was the product of Borte's capture by a rival tribe early in Genghis Khan's career. Whether this was true or not didn't matter. The rumors existed, and they poisoned the relationship between the brothers. Chagatai refused to accept Jochi as a legitimate heir. Jochi, for his part, began acting more and more independently, making decisions about his territory without consulting the Great Khan. Genghis Khan managed to keep a lid on these tensions through sheer force of personality. When your father is the greatest conqueror in human history, you think twice before defying him. But even he couldn't completely contain the growing rivalry. Jochi died in 1227, possibly just months before Genghis Khan himself, and there were whispers that Genghis Khan had ordered his death because Jochi was becoming too independent, too rebellious. We'll never know the truth, but the fact that such rumors were believable tells you everything about the tensions or AD building. When Genghis Khan died, Ogedei became Great Khan as planned, and for a while the system worked. Ogedei was actually a pretty capable ruler. He completed the conquest of northern China. He sent armies west into Russia and Eastern Europe. Under his rule, the Mongol Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. The Mongols smashed the Russian principalities, destroyed the Kingdom of Hungary, and were poised to invade Western Europe when Ogedei died in 1241, and this is where everything starts to unravel. According to Mongol tradition, when a Great Khan died, all the Mongol princes had to return to Mongolia for a Kurultai to elect the new Khan. So Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis and ruler of the Golden Horde, recalled his armies from the gates of Vienna. The Mongols withdrew from Europe not because they were defeated, but because of their own succession laws. Europe was saved by Ogedei's death and the Mongol tradition of electing their leader. But here's what started to happen. The Kurultais started taking longer and longer. The elections became more and more contentious. Different branches of the family started backing different candidates. And while these succession disputes were happening, the various khanates were becoming more and more autonomous, more and more independent. They were starting to think of themselves not as parts of one empire, but as separate empires that just happened to share a common ancestor. After Ogedei, his widow Torogene ruled as regent for 5 years. Then their son Gyuk became Khan, but he died after only 2 years. Then there was a power struggle between the descendants of Ogedei and the descendants of Tolu. This struggle lasted years. There were accusations of poisoning, rumors of coups, threats of civil war. Finally, Mongke, a grandson of Tolui, became Great Khan in 1251, but only after what essentially amounted to a purge of the Ogedei faction. Now we've got a serious problem. The Chagatai Khanate and the Golden Horde don't fully recognize Mongke's legitimacy. They pay lip service to his authority, but they're increasingly going their own way. And when Mongke dies in 1259 during a campaign in China, the empire effectively splits. Mongke's brothers Kublai and Arik Bokhe both claim the title of Great Khan. Kublai is leading campaigns in China. Arik Bokhe is in the traditional Mongol heartland. Both call Kurultais. Both get elected by their supporters and then they go to war brother against brother. Mongol against Mongol. The unthinkable is happening. The unity that Genghis Khan created, the unity that made the Mongols unstoppable, is shattering. Kublai eventually wins this civil war, and he goes on to become one of the most famous Mongol rulers. He completes the conquest of China, establishes the Yuan dynasty, builds the most magnificent capital the world had ever seen. He's the Kublai Khan that Marco Polo wrote about, ruling from his palace of Xanadu. But here's the thing. Kublai Khan's victory is actually the end of the unified Mongol Empire, because when Kublai won, the other Khanates basically said, "Fine, you can call yourself Great Khan, but we're not following your orders." The Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia all became independent in everything but name. They still acknowledged theoretical connection to the Great Khan, but in practice they were separate states. They had their own foreign policies. They sometimes went to war with each other. The Mongol Empire as a unified entity was finished. And this is where the secret really starts to do its damage, because it's not just about succession disputes, it's about something deeper. It's about the fundamental incompatibility between nomadic Mongol culture and ruling a vast, settled empire. See, the Mongols were nomads. Their entire way of life was built around moving with their herds, living in portable felt tents, being mobile and flexible. This lifestyle created incredible warriors. Mongol children learned to ride and shoot before they could walk properly. Every adult male was a potential soldier. The entire society could mobilize for war at a moment's notice. This was their strength. But when you conquer vast territories full of cities and farmers, you can't maintain that lifestyle. You need administrators. You need tax collectors. You need bureaucracies. You need to stay in one place and govern. And the moment you do that, you start to become like the people you conquered. You start to become sedentary, civilized, soft from the perspective of traditional Mongol culture. And this created a massive identity crisis within the Mongol ruling class. Do we hold on to our traditional nomadic ways and risk losing control of our empire? Or do we adapt to the needs of ruling settled populations and risk losing our Mongol identity? Different parts of the empire answered this question differently, and this accelerated their divergence. Kublai Khan in China went all in on becoming Chinese. He adopted Chinese administrative systems, Chinese court rituals, Chinese culture. He built a Chinese-style capital. He patronized Chinese arts. His successors became more and more Chinese and less Mongol. Traditional Mongols from the steppes looked at the Yuan dynasty and saw traitors to their heritage. Meanwhile, the Ilkhanate in Persia did something similar. They adopted Persian administrative practices, converted to Islam, married into Persian aristocracy. They became Persian rulers who happened to be of Mongol descent. The Golden Horde in Russia maintained more of their nomadic lifestyle, but they too adapted, incorporating Russian administrative practices and eventually converting to Islam as well. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia was perhaps the most traditional, but even they couldn't remain pure nomads while ruling cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. So now you have four khanates that are not only politically separate, but culturally diverging. They're adopting different religions. They're adapting to different local cultures. They're speaking different languages in their courts. The thing that made them Mongol, the shared culture and identity that Genghis Khan created, is dissolving. And then the wars start. Not just succession disputes, but actual wars between the khanates. In the 1260s, the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate go to war over Azerbaijan and the Caucasus. This war lasts, on and off, for decades. These are Mongols killing Mongols, grandsons of Genghis Khan ordering the destruction of cities ruled by other grandsons of Genghis Khan. The Chagatai Khanate fragments into eastern and western portions, which then fight each other. The Yuan Din. Asti in China faces constant rebellions, and eventually gets overthrown by the Ming dynasty in 1368. The Ilkhanate collapses into civil war in the 1330s and fragments into multiple small states. The Golden Horde holds on longer, but eventually breaks apart in the 15th century. By 1400, barely 150 years after Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire is completely gone. It's been replaced by dozens of smaller states, many of which are still nominally ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan, but which have nothing to do with each other and often nothing Mongol about them except the ancestry of their rulers. So what was the secret? The secret was this: Genghis Khan built an empire based on unity, but he ensured its division. He created a system where power had to be shared among multiple heirs, and sharing power inevitably leads to competing power centers, and competing power centers inevitably lead to conflict. He knew this, he had to have known this, but he did it anyway because the alternative, concentrating all power in a single heir, was even more dangerous given Mongol culture and the risk of tyranny or incompetence. The secret was that the very thing that made the Mongols strong, their tribal confederation structure where different clans had to cooperate and share power, became their fatal weakness when scaled up to a world empire. You can unite tribes through personal relationships, marriage alliances, and the force of one man's personality, but you can't maintain that across millions of square miles and millions of people once that one man is gone. The secret was that the Mongols' nomadic culture, which made them incredible conquerors, was fundamentally incompatible with ruling settled empires. They could destroy any army, conquer any city, but they couldn't maintain their identity while governing cities. And the moment they started to lose their cultural unity, their political unity became impossible. The secret was that Genghis Khan's genius was as a destroyer and a unifier of nomadic tribes. But he never solved the problem of how to transfer that unified empire to the next generation intact. Maybe he couldn't solve it. Maybe no one could have. Maybe the very nature of how the Mongols organized themselves made a lasting empire impossible. And there's a deeper lesson here, something that applies to way more than just the Mongol Empire. Every successful organization, whether it's a company, a movement, or an empire, is built on certain principles and structures that work brilliantly in one context, but become fatal weaknesses in another. The Mongol Confederation model worked perfectly for uniting nomadic tribes and conquering the world. It failed catastrophically at maintaining a stable, multi-generational empire. Success contains the seeds of failure. The things that make you great in one phase become the things that destroy you in the next phase. And the tragic irony is that often you can't abandon the things that made you successful without losing your identity, your purpose, the very essence of what you are. Genghis Khan faced an impossible choice: create a system for succession that preserved Mongol traditions and values, but inevitably led to division, or abandon those traditions for a more centralized system that might preserve the empire but would destroy Mongol culture. He chose to preserve the culture, knowing it would eventually destroy the empire. And maybe that was the right choice, because the Mongol Empire is gone, but Mongol identity survived. There are millions of Mongols today, proud of their heritage, celebrating the legacy of Genghis Khan. If he had created a centralized hereditary monarchy like European kingdoms, the empire might have lasted longer as a political entity, but it would have ceased to be Mongol. The ruling class would have become Chinese or Persian or Russian, and Mongol identity would have been absorbed and forgotten. Maybe Genghis Khan understood this. Maybe he chose cultural survival over political survival. But here's the thing that really gets me. Even though the unified Mongol Empire only lasted about 150 years, its impact on world history was absolutely profound and permanent. The Mongols reshaped the map of Eurasia. They ended the Islamic Golden Age by destroying Baghdad. They ended the Song dynasty in China. They destroyed the kingdom of Khwarezm. They crippled the power of the Russian principalities for centuries. But they also connected the world in unprecedented ways. The diseases, technologies, ideas and goods that moved along Mongol trade routes changed everything. The Black Death probably spread to Europe via Mongol trade routes, killing a third of the population, but ultimately contributing to the end of feudalism. Gunpowder technology spread west from China through Mongol intermediaries, changing warfare forever. The exchange of crops and agricultural techniques along the Silk Road altered what people ate across 3 continents. And here's something most people don't know. The Mongol Empire's collapse actually created the conditions for the age of exploration. When the Mongol Empire fragmented and the Silk Road became less safe, European merchants started looking for alternative routes to Asia. That's what sent Columbus sailing west and Vasco da Gama sailing around Africa. The Mongol Empire's collapse literally led to the discovery of the Americas by Europeans and the beginning of the global age. So in a weird way, the Mongol Empire's destruction was as historically important as its creation. The collapse forced the world to find new ways to connect, new routes of trade and communication, and ultimately led to the modern globalized world. And the descendants of the Mongol Empire kept trying to recreate it. Timur, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, tried to rebuild the empire in the 14th century and briefly succeeded before his death ended that dream. The Mughal Empire in India was founded by descendants of Genghis Khan and ruled there for 3 centuries. The Qing dynasty in China was founded by the Manchus, who were closely related to the Mongols. The legacy kept echoing, but the unified empire, the dream of one world under Mongol rule, died because of a secret that Genghis Khan himself encoded into its DNA. He divided the empire to preserve Mongol culture. He shared power to prevent tyranny. He created a confederation to honor tribal traditions. And all of these decisions, made for good reasons, ensured that the empire would tear itself apart the moment his personal authority was gone. It's one of history's great tragic ironies. The greatest conqueror who ever lived, the man who built the largest land empire in human history, could conquer the world but couldn't conquer the problem of succession. He could unite the Mongol tribes, but couldn't create a system that would keep them united after his death. He could topple empires that had stood for centuries but couldn't make his own empire last 200 years. The secret that destroyed the Mongol Empire wasn't really a secret at all. It was written into their laws, their traditions, their culture. It was visible to anyone who looked. The empire was divided among Genghis Khan's sons. The great Khan was elected, not born. Regional rulers had their own armies and treasuries. These weren't hidden flaws, they were features of the system, features that made perfect sense in Mongol culture, but which doomed the empire to eventual fragmentation. And that's what makes this story so fascinating and so tragic. The Mongols weren't destroyed by their enemies. They weren't defeated in battle. They weren't conquered by some greater force. They were destroyed by the internal contradictions in their own system, Contradictions that existed from the very beginning, that Genghis Khan himself created, and that ultimately proved unsolvable. Every empire falls eventually. That's just history. But most empires are destroyed from outside. The Mongol Empire destroyed itself from within, following a script written by its own founder, a script that led inevitably to division, to civil war, to collapse. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's that there are some problems that have no good solutions, only trade-offs. Genghis Khan chose to preserve Mongol culture and traditions over creating a stable succession system, and that choice destroyed the empire but preserved the culture. Maybe that was the best choice available. Maybe there was no way to do both, or maybe the lesson is simpler and more depressing. Maybe it's that all human institutions are temporary. The Mongol Empire seemed unstoppable at its height, but it was gone in 5 generations. Rome lasted longer but eventually fell. Every empire, every dynasty, every great power eventually ends. The structures that create success in one era become obsolete or destructive in the next. Nothing lasts forever. But then again, maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to build something that lasts forever. Maybe the point is the impact you have while you're here. And by that measure, the Mongol Empire was one of the most successful enterprises in human history. It changed the world, it connected civilizations, it spread technologies and ideas across continents. It influenced the course of human history in ways we're still discovering today. The secret that destroyed the Mongol Empire was encoded in its foundation. But the legacy of what it built, the connections it forged, the changes it made, those outlasted the empire itself. And maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to build something meaningful, even if it's temporary, to have an impact, even if it doesn't last forever, to try to solve impossible problems, even if we can't solve them perfectly. Genghis Khan couldn't make his empire eternal, but 700 years later, we're still talking about him, still studying him, still trying to understand what he built and why it fell. And that's a kind of immortality that most people never achieve. The Mongol Empire is dead, but its story lives on, and in that story is a lesson about the limitations of power, the impossibility of perfect systems, and the inevitable decay of all human institutions. So the next time you hear about the Mongol Empire, remember, it's not just a story about conquest and destruction. It's a story about a man who saw a fundamental problem in human organization and tried to solve it, knowing his solution was imperfect but doing his best anyway. It's a story about the tension between tradition and innovation, between unity and diversity, between cultural preservation and political survival. And it's a story that reminds us that even the mightiest empire, the greatest conqueror, the most brilliant system, contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. That's the secret. And now you know it too.